Okay.
Okay, you can see my screen
Yes.
and we're good? Okay.
Yes. Okay, let's going to start. It's already 11 a.m. So welcome to the Bachelor Diary Inside. So thank you for joining us today for this month University of Wisconsin Division of Extension Bachelor Diary Inside, a monthly webinar series offered on the third Tuesday of each month. Bachelor Diary Inside provides the latest research-based dairy-based information to provide animal welfare, breeding, and genetic selection, automation and modernization, and also nutritional decision for producers, dairy workers, agricultural professionals, and managers. My name is Alison Pau. I'm the bilingual regional dairy educator from UW-Madison Extension, and we hope to provide this opportunity as an informal discussion on topics today. And this is a webinar format, so please add any questions or comments in the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. If this webinar is being recorded, we are going to provide the record webinar link by the end of this week or next week to hope to share this information with others that you work with. So for this, we're gonna start with the first speaker today is Jackie McCarville. She's the regional dairy educator for Grand, Greene, Iowa, and Lafayette counties. Jackie has her bachelor degrees in animal science with a dairy emphasis from UW-Platteville, and Jackie has been at the UW-Madison Extension since 2016. In addition of working with the UW-Madison Extension, Jackie also helps on her husband's family dairy farm. So thank you, Jackie, for being here, and we can start the presentation.
Thank you, Allison. Today, so I'm really just going to talk about the risks of inadequate fiber in diets. And why is that important? So having adequate fiber levels in a ration is important because the different levels of digestibility of fiber is due to those differences in the amount of lignin in the plant. Lignin is part of the plant cell wall that's going to provide that plant with the radicity. And fiber is important for microbial fermentation, which in turn supplies energy to the cow. The primary product of the microbial fermentation of fiber are the precursors of fat and milk. And nutritionally, fiber is the portion of the feed that's going to limit our digestion, requires chewing for particle size reduction, and occupies space in the rumen because of bulkiness, thus limiting that intake of the animals. So when it comes to why are people feeding those low fiber diets, fiber is lower in energy than non-fiber. So we're usually cutting and harvesting these products as tight as possible to get more energy and milk from the cows. However, you can go overboard on this and not get any additional milk. Low quality fiber is usually lower in energy, and many then feed energy products or ingredients to make up that energy lost from those low quality fiber products. If local fiber sources have failed, we're going to use a substitute for those forages that is then going to be used to stretch those forage supplies. Failure in making these quality fiber products really can come from poor weather, getting too much rain, not being able to make those forages in a timely manner. And when supplies of forage are short, especially here in the Midwest, corn is usually cheaper to feed than some of those high quality alfalfa products brought in from several states away. There is high value in growing or purchasing a high quality fiber, whether it is homegrown, purchased as a forage, or purchased as a byproduct. All protect you from overfeeding starch while helping you get more milk. Cows will consume more forage, which is of higher energy content when forages are high in that NDFD, so that NDF digestibility, which is a measure of the fiber digestibility and compare the feeding value of forages. RFQ also is an estimate of how much energy a non-lactating animal will obtain daily from a particular forage if it is fed only that forage all day. Byproducts can be a great fiber source However, there are some questions that should be asked before we start implementing them in a diet. So how cost competitive is that byproduct? Can you add the product without sacrificing performance? How easy is it to obtain that byproduct? Is the product of consistent quality every time you need a load? Do you need to worry about the risk of mycotoxins when feeding that byproduct? And while that product might contain significant levels of NDF, does the physical form contribute to the effective fiber? When we look at the byproducts here that are available to our area, here's a list of some of those that are commonly seen on farms around us. And there are many good, highly digestible byproducts that the rumen microbes are going to use for energy rather than starch. These byproducts are typically low in starch, but they're often going to contain sugar, digestible fiber, and soluble fiber. When we transition over to those disorders associated with low fiber diets, we really want to talk about acidosis. So the pH level in the rumen is a critical indicator if an animal is getting adequate fiber or getting fiber that is chopped too fine. Feeding forage that is chopped too fine or lacking adequate fiber can then create a chain reaction that is going to reduce chewing time, reduces the amount of saliva that is produced, which in turn is going to cause the rumen pH to drop. And as the rumen pH drops below 6.2, the microbes responsible for fiber digestion are going to decrease, while the microbes responsible for digesting starch and sugar is going to increase, which drops the pH further. If that pH falls below 5.9, digestion of fiber essentially is going to stop. So ruminal acidosis is the condition where rumen pH falls below an optimal physiological range. And there are two distinct types of acidosis. The first, more severe condition is acute ruminal acidosis, which is generally defined as a ruminal pH below 5.0. And the second, less severe and more common condition is going to be that subacute ruminal acidosis, which is generally defined as that rumen pH in the range of 5 to 5.5. Other things that can happen is we can get laminitis in our dairy cattle, which is the inflammation of the laminae and the corium of the hoof. The effects can be manifested by a variety of foot disorders. And it's important to note that hoof issues can cost a dairy between $90 to $300 per case. And along with these foot issues also comes the potential milk production loss and reproductive issues. Another potential disorder is a displaced abomasum, which is when the abomasum becomes filled with gas and rises to the left or right side. Typically, this is going to occur during the transition period, but can also occur in mid to late lactations when diets aren't adequate. And a typical displaced abomasum can cost around $700 per case, including all those setbacks that come along with that. Other issues could include liver abscesses, which the pictures at the bottom of here are going to show the different variations. So the one on the far left is no abscesses, and the one on the right is going to be a liver that's full of abscesses. So there's no visual signs with this, but they typically don't gain weight like a healthy animal, and those abscesses are really found during slaughter. Cattle can also be off feed, lacking that want to eat the feed in front of them, and also can have low butter fat. So the depressed milk fat that is at least 0.2% less than the breed average. Other issues can be that fat to protein inversion. So if the true milk protein test is 0.2 units higher than that milk fat test, so if the true protein is 3.1 and the milk fat is 2.9, so we're inverted there. If over 10% of our milking herd is inverted, we really want to look for rumen within that herd. Other visual signs of stress from low fiber diets include that reduction in cud chewing, reduction in feed intake, decreased rumination time, sore tender feet, decreased milk production, and really the differences in manure from those thick stacking piles to being loose and variable. Other ration considerations for feeding a low-fiber diet are going to include dry corn, which isn't as fermentable in the rumen as high-moisture corn, flake corn, or other processed corn sources. It is recommended to not feed highly fermentable corn sources when feeding a low-fiber diet. A finer grind corn is more acceptable when feeding a TMR ration, while a coarser grind is going to be more optimum for in-component feeding, which is going to help with that potential overfeeding of starch. Many forage labs can run a grain particle size report on these corn products. Component feeding, cows should first have access to hay to establish that rumen mat before feeding of the grain. And it's also recommended not to feed more than 7 pounds of concentrate per meal when doing that component feeding. Really don't want to have that slug feeding to those animals. If you're using a TMR, you're really going to reduce that slug feeding because everything's going to be all in there at one time. We also want consistency from one end of the bunk to the other. However, it is extremely important to not overmix, as overmixing is going to break up that particle length. On the flip side, it is also important to not have too much long particle length either. We want to establish proper moisture content to help prevent sorting of the diet. We can utilize liquid products such as molasses, whey, or water to help create a less sortable diet. Utilizing a Penn State shaker box can help determine if you have adequate particle size distribution in your TMR. There are other options to also consider when feeding a low fiber diet to potentially keep things from going wrong. We can add rumen buffers up to 0.8% of the drying matter to help establish that rumen pH. Frequent testing of feeds and forages should also be considered. This is going to help you know the fiber levels in the ration being fed. Some farms are doing this testing on a monthly basis. Feed bunk management is another consideration. Feed push-ups are really critical to make sure cows have access to appropriate amounts of feed. And we want to avoid long periods of time with no feed in front of these cows. When this occurs, where they have long periods of no feed, those cows are going to seek out certain portions of the diet. Considerations should also be had around how much bunk space a cow has for eating. It is recommended they have 24 to 30 inches for a lactating dairy cow, with pre-fresh and those fresh animals really having more space. We also want to make sure we have the appropriate amounts of time with feed in front of those cows. So once again, making sure that they're not going long periods of time with nothing in front of them. Keeping cows comfortable from the heat is also going to help them take in more smaller meals, making sure we got those fans going, sprinklers if we can do that, especially during those hot temperatures, to get them up and keep eating instead of doing some of that slug feeding. But if you still want to feed a low fiber diet, so my recommendations are making sure you're doing that consistent feed testing, paying attention to the cows, really watching those feed intakes, checking that ration particle size, and watching that manure consistency. Low fiber diets can be fed as long as we are following these 5 steps and making sure things are going well. When we're not taking care of some of these management things and trying to feed a low fiber diet, that's when we could have things considerably go wrong and not in our favor. And so with that, that is the end of my presentation. And we will take questions at the end. And so I will stop screen sharing and let Allison have control again.
Thank you so much. Like Jackie said, please, if you have any questions, just wait until the end of the second presentation and we have all pool of questions for the 2 speakers. So for the second speaker that we have is Dr. Luiz Ferraretto. Dr. Luiz is a dairy nutrition specialist from UW-Madison. Dr. Luiz has been an extension specialist since May 2020. Prior to his current role, he was a postdoctoral research at the Minor Institute and an assistant professor of livestock nutrition at the University of Florida. His current research and extension programs are focused on forage quality and digestibility, dairy nutrition, nutritional management, and feeding behavior. So thank you so much, Dr. Luis, for joining us, and you can start the presentation.
Thank you, Alison, for the introduction, and thank you all for attending today, this presentation. So our goal for today will be to discuss a little bit of silage losses, how we can mitigate this issue, a little bit of the use of microbial inoculants, and we'll try to show a little bit of the economical aspect of that, right? Why we should always target to minimize forage losses and so on. But to understand all of that, I think we have to go back and understand how we have silage losses, regardless if we are talking about dry matter or nutrient losses, right, during silage production, silage fermentation, and so on. So I think the first thing we have to understand is that when it comes to dry matter losses, right, we have to separate between unavoidable and avoidable dry matter losses, right? So basically, if we consider unavoidable losses, we have three main sources, which would be field loss, respiration, which is basically plant cell respiration after the material is harvested. It's already in the silo until all the oxygen is used up so the proper fermentation can begin. And then fermentation itself. At the end of the day, silage fermentation is basically utilizing some water-soluble carbohydrates or sugars, if you will, in order to have bacterial proliferation and then lactic and acetic acid accumulation so pH can go down, and then we can have silage preservation, right? So obviously there is some losses there, but I don't see that as a loss, right? That's kind of an investment because that's what we need, right? To make sure we have enough fermentation early on, accumulation of acids, pH goes down, so we can actually properly store that forage. And usually these have, 5 to 14% dry matter losses. Obviously, depending on your management, you can minimize the unavoidable losses, right? So I think it's quite important that we minimize as much as we can. But then there are avoidable losses, and this remains an issue because these are losses that we have to prevent because it's not bringing us any benefit. Like fermentation brings us some benefit. All these other losses do not, right? For this avoidable dry matter losses side. There are three main ways that we can have avoidable dry matter losses. The first one is secondary fermentation, right? So if you have any sort of undesired microorganism proliferating and taking control of fermentation, Clostridia, for example, will be the most common, right? This is unavoidable losses because basically Clostridia will be utilizing some of the nutrients that we would prefer that good bacteria utilize that so we can have good preservation. The other two sources will be related to air exposure. The first one is during storage. So if you have any puncture in the silage plastic, any holes in the bag or the bunker that allows for the entrance of oxygen, that's some sort of aerobic deterioration during storage that will be compromising fermentation, giving yeast and molds the possibility of proliferate and deteriorate silage. And then we have aerobic deterioration after storage. This happens when you open the silo, right? We have to. I believe we don't have a choice for that. But after oxygen goes in, there is a chain reaction that occurs. So yeast and molds that are typically dormant, they basically wake up, start proliferating and deteriorating, right? Even though this will be happening, we can mitigate this loss and minimize that as much as possible. So we will discuss a little bit of that today. But if we think about dry matter losses, right, basically we have between 5 and 40% if we take the two extremes from this specific slide. So if you think from that perspective, this drastically affects the cost of corn silage, right? Because at the end of the day, let's suppose that you have 1,000 tons of corn silage going to a silo. If you have between 5 and 40% dry matter loss, it means that you will be feeding between 600 and 950 tons, right? But the cost you pay to produce that silage is exactly the same, right? So basically per unit of feed fed, your cost goes up, right? And I think that's quite important because at the end of the day, I think that silage storage and good metrics for dry matter nutrient losses should be considered almost like a feed efficiency metric, right? Because you will be buying all the supplies, having all the investment to produce that forage. If you cannot feed it, then you're losing efficiency. But if you get some numbers from a more recent study, right, basically, even silage with very good management has losses, right? And we discussed a little bit about some of those in the previous slide where we show some of those unavoidable dry matter losses. But it's important to remember that losses, they pile up, right? So we often try to optimize all the different management practice, and that's actually the way to go, right? Because at the moment you start having issues with one or the other practice that you implement, they will be creating losses on top of the other managements and so on, right? So if you think about farms with good management, usually they will have 13 or less percent losses. And then as you start moving towards farms with not so good management, sometimes without covering, which I know it's not as common anymore today as it used to be, but we see once in a while some issues associated with that, right? And a lot of excessive rain during ensiling as well as during feed out, there's a lot of potential to have increased amount of losses associated with silage production, right? So if we try to put that into a simple calculation here, basically, if we use some of those numbers from this study that estimated some of those losses, let's assume for a moment that corn silage cost about $60 per ton. And I know that this number is variable depending on where you are and your production system, but if you calculate what is the cost of 1 ton of silage fed based on your dry matter losses, for each of those values here, 13, 24, 35, and 58, and I know some of those are very high numbers that you shouldn't see as you probably do a good job covering and so on, those would be the prices that it actually costs to feed 1 ton of silage, right? So you can see that the number goes much higher than it typically costs. And I think that's very important because as you start going through ration formulation and trying to pay attention to cost of diets, this is one of the reasons why sometimes the diet gets too expensive, right? Obviously, there are many reasons for that, right? The specific cost of each ingredient and so on, but dry matter loss certainly plays a major role, right? Well, why is this important, right? Well, I think every year this is important, but this year specifically, I think we have to pay very close attention on how to mitigate this issue because I think we have another very unusual year in terms of weather. And because of that, I think we're going to have some very specific conditions, especially for corn silage fermentation, that we have to pay close attention to. So last year I was watching the webinar about this year's corn silage that Dr. Gazer presented with Horst Dierman, and they run this survey, okay? And I do not know how many people actually reply and where they are from, so I'm trying to be careful here to don't generalize what's happening, but from all the respondents, about 37% said that they had a very hot and very wet season, and 29% a very average in terms of temperature and very wet season, right? So I think it's safe to say that the wet season was the common theme here for this discussion. And talking with others, I think that actually looks like what we saw in many areas across the state, right here in Wisconsin. So I'll be using that as the basis to continue this discussion today, okay? Obviously, you may have a different scenario depending on where you are, right? And depending on how the weather was, it may change a little bit the response, right? But let's assume for a moment that this was a very wet year across the entire state. So if we go back to some data that was put together by Dr. Joe Lauer, basically years that are wet, we should expect a little bit of a lower yield compared to normal years. And I think that's quite important because if you have a lower yield or you expect lower yield, you have to maximize as much as you can and ensure that you are saving as much forage as possible with silage preservation, right? So I think that some of those discussions today become quite relevant if this is your scenario. Obviously, I'm also hearing people say, some people saying that they don't expect any issues with yield. So this may be not much of an issue in certain areas, but I still think we should pay close attention to that, right? Other key discussions that we are hearing, and I think we should pay close attention to, is that it looks like this year we're going to have a lot of maturity spread within a field, within a dairy, right? And in some cases, we're going to see probably 2 harvests. I think that that's a complex scenario, right? Because you have to start harvesting, prepare everything, and then after, I don't know, 20 days, maybe a month, go back and harvest again, right? And this may create some complications in order to go to the field, harvest the proper maturity, and so on, right? So paying close attention to silage maturity this year will be very important because depending on how complex it is to go back for second harvest, you may need to adjust harvest settings and so on to do a very good job with that. Okay? Another discussion that we are seeing is people considering to stretch some of their silage inventory to dilute potential lower NDFD values. Okay, another thing that happens when you have very wet year is a slightly lower NDF digestibility of corn silage. So I heard some discussions about maybe stretching inventory potential and so on. And I think that fits very well with the discussion today because whenever you stretch your forage inventory, it means that you are feeding for a longer period. So you give the silage more time to be exposed to air and deterioration. And I know that we cannot fix last year corn silage with the discussion today, but perhaps it's something to consider for future years and so on. And the last key point of discussion that we are hearing is about silage hygiene, right? One of the key things that I learned while a faculty in Florida is that whenever you have a very hot and humid scenario, it causes a lot of disease pressure for corn, okay? I'm very far from an agronomist. I do not understand plant physiology or plant pathology or anything related to that as some of my colleagues would, but I could see very clearly that in Florida, we used to plant 2 seasons, spring and summer. And during the summer, when we had higher temperatures and more rain, the plants had a lot of issues with disease, and we have to be way more careful with harvesting. And I think that's important because if this wet year is true, we have to make sure we pay close attention to that and ensure that we are not bringing a lot of undesired microorganisms and do a good job solving some of those issues. Okay? So said that, I think that something that we may expect this year is a combination of ISE modes, okay, but they're not gonna affect the beginning of our fermentation. Okay, I think if we think about silage fermentation, usually what we see is that after oxygen is used up, bacteria starts proliferating, they consume sugars, and lactic and acetic acid will accumulate, pH will go down, we're gonna reach a stable fermentation, right? Fermentation continues, but it's not so pronounced that we see a lot of drop in any or increase in any of those values, right? And that's what we want. But in order to do that, we need to ensure that a lot of different things are done properly. And even though it sounds like that textbook, I think there are a lot of things we have to pay attention to, especially with some of the uncertainty that the weather is causing this year, right? So I think the most important thing for us will be to ensure good packing density and consequently mitigate dry matter loss, right? So basically, this is an older data set, but I think it's still quite relevant that if you have good density, packing density, you minimize dry matter loss. And I think that should be one of our targets today. And the only way to do that is to reduce porosity, okay? Porosity is basically the amount of oxygen entrapped within the silage mass. Okay? Just think like this. You have a jar, and then inside the jar, you put a lot of golf balls, okay? So you can fill the jar as better as you can, but you know that even though it's full of those golf balls, there is still a space for air, right? That's how silage is. It doesn't matter how good job you do, there is always a little bit of oxygen entrapped. The question is, can you minimize that? And there are ways you can minimize that, okay? One of those is proper maturity as well as proper particle size harvest. And I think those two factors are associated, right? Why is that? Well, if you end up harvesting a material that's very dry, usually those particles are coarser if you use the same theoretical length of cut or the same shop length, if you will. Okay, so if you have to delay harvest, or if you have two harvests and you have to delay your second harvest, be careful with that and try to make sure you reduce a little bit your shop length so the particles are short, and this way you don't have a lot of oxygen entrapped, right? Also, make sure you have proper packing time, packing layer, so you can make sure everything goes a long way. And this year specifically, try to be very careful with how dirty your equipment is, right? We are seeing, again, a lot of potential wet weather. So if you harvest and there is some rain around, make sure you clean some of those packing tractors and so on, and avoid as much as possible to bring any soil or mud or anything to the silo, because that's actually where a lot of the contaminants, if you will, yeast and molds, for example, will be. So this will be quite important. And the reason why we have to mitigate a lot of that is after we have the silos open for feeding, we have basically another chain reaction that starts with air exposure, and then yeast will wake up, yeast will start using lactic acid, and then pH starts to go up, okay? At a certain point, molds will wake up, and then they start deteriorating silage even further, okay? We cannot stop this process. This is natural, but we can reduce it, okay? And I think that's quite important. The problem is, depending on the amount of yeasts that you have available, this may be more or less pronounced, right? I'm using this older data set here as an example because there's a lot of variation when we evaluate silage fermentation and microbial counts, right? If you are a dairy or a beef operation that have low yeast counts, this is not so much of a problem, but the more yeast counts that you have, worse it gets, okay? And even though we don't have a lot of research with the effects on nutritive value, I'm gonna use one study to describe a little bit of the potential effects, okay? So some years ago, this group of researchers, they collected high moisture corn samples and they extracted the yeast population of those samples, okay? And then what they did is they added different amounts of the yeast into rumen fluid, okay? So basically they had cannulated cows, collected rumen fluid, and then they run a laboratory study. They collected a Bermuda grass sample, I think it was a Bermuda grass sample, and they put that into the rumen fluid, okay? And basically was a sample that didn't have the yeast contamination, okay? And then they add low, medium, and high yeast counts to those samples. Look what happens with NDF digestibility as you have more yeast, right? So if we are talking about control, those are the samples without any yeast added to the rumen fluid. And then low yeast is the low counts, medium counts, and then high counts. And you can see that the more yeasts are available, less digestible it gets. And that's not the effect in the silage that you are feeding, it's actually the effect in the cow, right? So if you allow me to run some simulations here, I ran some of the values that they had for the 12 hours incubation. And I used the NDF digestibility values to predict milk production using our milk per ton spreadsheet, okay, which we typically use for corn silage evaluation, okay? And you can see that milk production goes down because fiber digestibility goes down. And yes, this is a prediction, but I think it's an important exercise to understand what is happening under those circumstances. And then based on that, we try to calculate income over corn silage cost, okay? In this case, I calculated based on the $60 per ton of corn silage and the income associated with the milk production predicted for those scenarios. And you can see that the more yeast you have, if this translates into lower fiber digestibility, basically you're losing income over corn silage cost in this case. Basically, I mimic what we do for income over feed cost. Okay, and I think that's quite important because if you're having this issue, you're not only losing some silage because of the faster deterioration at feed out, but you're also losing quality. So one of the options we have to mitigate yeast and mold proliferation at feed out is inoculating silage with Lactobacillus buchneri based inoculants. Okay, so what I'm showing you today is a study where we compile a lot of information in the literature and run a meta-analysis. Okay, basically a meta-analysis is we rerun the statistics using multiple studies to see how powerful this practice could be. So this has about 158 studies. And here what we have is the average values for control silage. Control silage in this case is not inoculated or was inoculated only with water to simulate the same conditions, but not an inoculant. Okay, and the difference is basically the silage inoculated with a Lactobacillus buchneri based inoculant minus the control group. Okay. This is a combination of Lactobacillus buchneri from multiple studies, multiple companies, multiple strains, different doses, different forages, and so on. Okay, so it's just to showcase the overall effect. And what you should expect is that lactic acid go down and acetic acid go up. Okay, why does that happen? Lactobacillus buchneri has the capability of changing the fermentation after a certain period. And instead of producing more lactic acid, they basically shift and even utilize some of the lactic acid towards acetic acid, okay? But Luis, lactic acid is important for silage preservation. Absolutely, right? And actually, the buchneri does produce lactic acid, okay? But the benefit of acetic acid, not only acetic acid, a little bit of acetic acid, you can see that the numbers here, lactic acid is still much higher than acetic acid, right? Is that acetic acid inhibits the proliferation of yeasts and consequently the proliferation of molds, right? So you can see as we reach the bottom rows here, that yeast and mold counts, they are lower when you use this type of microbial inoculant, okay? And the aerobic stability is a little bit better. Basically, aerobic stability is a metric that we use in the lab, okay, to simulate silage shelf life. Okay, it does not mean that this is the number of hours that silage is good. It's just the difference that we can see so we can simulate shelf life. Okay? However, something that's very important about those inoculants is that even though they work very early on, you can see the green bars here that aerobic stability is better between 7 and 30 days of fermentation. This benefit increases over time, right? So if you have opportunity to allow silage to ferment a little bit longer before opening, this benefit will be even better. I know that this is not always a possibility, but I'm mentioning because it could be a good combination of management practice with a microbial inoculant, okay? And this is also true when we consider yeast and mold counts, right? So basically you can see that this type of inoculant will inhibit yeast counts very early on from 7 to 30 days, but does an even better job as fermentation progresses. And I think that's quite important because if you plan to feed silage for longer, like if you decide to stretch your next silage inventory, for example, or if you expect more yeast and mold counts, this may become very important, okay? And if you consider some of those values, I use some of those yeast counts and some of the NDFD values based on that rumen fluid study that I showed you earlier to predict milk per ton again, and then try to simulate income over silage cost just to have an idea of that. And you can see that by preserving more and making sure that you don't have so much of the NDFD issue, you can probably have a better scenario in terms of income. Obviously, you have to consider the price of the inoculant and so on. And there are a lot of different inoculants out there, okay? I want to tell you that you have to be very careful. You have to make very good choices. So make sure you talk to different people and see, okay, so which inoculants are good? There are a lot of Buckner-I-based inoculants that have a lot of research, okay? And I highly suggest you to use some of those that are very consistent. Right? That's how I suggest you to choose some of those. And to finalize a little bit of this discussion, we often don't discuss a lot of molds when we talk about silage because molds happens after yeast, but molds play a major role on forage losses, right? You can see that the highest accounts associated with molds, more dry matter losses you will see, especially at feed out, right? So considering some of those type of inoculants may be quite helpful under those scenarios. Okay? Another thing that may become very important this year to avoid yeast and mold counts is, in addition to measuring maturity as dry matter, kernel milk line, pay close attention to disease pressure. Okay, if you see that you're having a lot of issues with ear rot, tar spot, and other diseases that may expedite the dry down rates of those plants, be very proactive and try to enter before those plants start drying too fast, because otherwise you may have some of the issues that we described earlier today. Right? So some implications associated with our discussion today. Obviously, there are a lot of different factors that affect corn silage. We discussed some of those today, and we try to associate those with what we are seeing this year in terms of corn silage, right? But there are a lot of other factors you have to consider. And obviously, each scenario is a different scenario. We try to generalize based on what we are seeing, right? Silage inoculants are widely used as an additive to improve silage quality. And I think that based on what we are seeing or hearing about silage hygiene, it may be an important consideration to use a Lactobacillus Buckneri-based inoculant. Right? Obviously, it depends again on the situation you have or your clients and what you could do to mitigate this issue. Okay? Remember that commercial inoculants, they vary in prices, strengths, and counts. We highly advise you to choose one that has enough research conducted by third parties and that have consistency, right? The most important thing that we want, regardless of the management practice that you establish, will be consistency. Okay? Said that, we would be happy to take any questions. In case you are hearing this webinar as a recorded section, here's my email. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Luis. Okay, we are open for questions. So any questions for both of the speakers? Well, let's see. Let's wait a little bit.
Allison, why don't you talk about the next BDI and your webinar series, and then maybe some will come in.
Of course. Yeah, so I hope everybody enjoys the webinar today, and please join us for next month. It's September 17th for the new concept of colostrum feeding for dairy calf. In this webinar, it's going to be Dr. Donald Zucker and also Dr. Ryan Brewer. I hope I can pronounce the last name correct. They will discuss the dairy producers, how they should consider feeding a smaller amount of colostrum to newborn calf. Because delivering the correct mass of immunoglobulin, in a smaller volume ensures the successful transfer or passive immunity, and is also very preferable to current colostrum feeding guidance. So feeding too large volume of this colostrum sometimes can cause serious complications that affect the health and the well-being in newborn calf. So if you want to be part of this webinar or next month, please register to the link, the go.wis.edu BDI 2324. Also, I wanna let you know that we are gonna develop the second edition of the El Break Info Lechero 2.0. That is a webinar in Spanish in celebration of the Hispanic heritage. So it's gonna be 10 sessions. It's gonna be in September, October, and November, every Wednesday at noon. We're gonna have different topics about genetics, nutrition, animal health, animal welfare, different topics that you can, if you wanna be part of this, please register. This is the link. It's gonna be just in Spanish. So the speakers will talk just in Spanish, and also we're gonna record a little bit of these webinars, and it's gonna be at the YouTube channel in Extension. So with that, I hope everybody can enjoy it. And if you don't speak English, but you know people like your dairy workers that they are willing to know more and learn, this is a great opportunity to register them, and they can have these sessions. So with that, thank you so much. If anybody has any questions, we just keep waiting. So if you want more information, you can go, obviously, university based dairy researches. Please visit the Extension Dairy Program on the website of the Dairy Extension Wisconsin.edu, or you also can find us in Facebook at Extension Agriculture. Jackie, do you think we can finish the session, or we still can wait for questions?
Yeah, I think we're good to go. If people have questions, feel free to reach out to either Louise or I, or Allison with her webinar series coming up. And with that, I think everyone have a great day.
Yeah, thank you so much for being part of this session. Thank you so much. Again, if you have questions, just contact Dr. Luis or Jackie to their email. Thank you so much for being here, and have a great day. Thank you so much.